So the FCC has just released an item stating that they're going to maintain the current radio frequency radiation limits. That's wireless, like from cell phones, Wi-Fi devices, as well as 5G. And they reference the FDA's opinion that the National Toxicology Program study doesn't apply to humans as part of the basis for that decision, among many other things that they've stated. So I'm here today with Dr. Deborah Davis of Environmental Health Trust, Dr. Ronald Melnick, who is a 28-year NIH scientist and who was the lead designer for the National Toxicology Program study, to comment on the FCC's recent item.
Yes, and I'm delighted that Dr. Melnick has agreed to work with Environmental Health Trust as a senior advisor to us now that he is retired from the federal government. And I really appreciate the work that he's doing to make sure people understand the importance of the National Toxicology Program findings. As Dr. Melnick and many others appreciate, every compound that we know causes cancer in people will also produce it in animals when adequately tested. That's why we study animals, to predict human effects and prevent them from occurring. However, in this particular situation, we have a very unusual set of circumstances. Dr. Melnick, would you please comment on what the FDA has said about the NTP study and your opinion about that?
Okay. Well, first, I think we need to go back many years when FDA requested that the NTP conduct studies on cell phone radiation in experimental animals because they wanted to obtain the data that would provide the basis to assess human health risk. This was in their nomination. They wanted the data to assess human health risk. So that's an important point in that at the time of the nomination, they recognized the value of the animal studies for assessing human health risk. And the reason for this was they were concerned that the exposure guidelines at the time were potentially inadequate for identifying non-thermal effects with chronic exposure.
Yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned that, because we forget that it was the FDA that originally asked for the study, because back then they began to think that the study standards, which were first developed in 1996, might be out of date by 1999. So it's quite ironic that now we have it in 2019. They're saying, oh, no, we think that those 23-year-old standards are just fine.
Right. So back in the late 90s, there was the concern that the guidelines, which were based on a rise in animal temperature, might not be protective against non-thermal effects associated with chronic exposure. These were short-term studies studying animal temperature rise with exposure to radiofrequency radiation. It provided no information on long-term chronic exposures at exposure levels that would not increase body temperature by 1 degree centigrade. So now that the NTP has performed the studies, the results have been analyzed very carefully. They underwent a 3-day peer review, which was an unusually long peer review for NTP studies. Typically, an NTP peer review on a chemical takes maybe 2 to 3 hours. This was a 3-day peer review. Quite unusual. There were approximately 11 experts on the peer review panel, and these are all external individuals with expertise in areas such as pathology, statistics, toxicology, who reviewed the data and came to the conclusion that the data showed clear evidence of carcinogenic activity. Now, that's the highest level that NTP attributes to an agent which causes tumors in animal models. Clear evidence was for the schwannomas of the heart, and there was also some evidence, one step lower, for gliomas, brain tumors. So the data, in addition, there were other effects associated with exposure in the NTP study. For example, there was DNA damage in the brain cells of rats and mice. There was a reduction in birth rates from rats that were exposed during gestation. And there was also a disease of heart muscle called cardiomyopathy.
Now, I've heard it said by some that the effects only occurred in male rats. You're telling us there are effects in mice and rats when it came to DNA damage, is that right?
DNA damage was observed in both rats and mice. And the cardiomyopathy was observed in female rats as well as in male rats.
So in other words, it's not just a problem of male rats. You had effects in female rats when it came to the heart, and you had effects in mice and rats when it came to DNA damage. And what about all other organs where there was an increase in cancer or damage, but it wasn't statistically quite as significant?
Right. There were also observations of gliomas and archionomas in female rats. However, the levels did not reach statistical significance, but these are very rare tumors in female rats. So the observation of these in exposed animals and none in the controls adds some more credibility to the findings in the male rats.
Mm-hmm.
So
why has the FDA rejected this study, in your opinion? What do they say, and why do you agree?
Well, they say that they disagree with the peer review panel. The peer review panel of 11 members called this clear evidence of carcinogenicity. The FDA simply says we disagree without giving a scientific rationale for the disagreement.
Now, you worked for the federal government for 3 decades. In your experience as a member of the National Toxicology Program, and frankly, in my experience as a member of the review board for that program, can you think of any other chemical or substance that ever was subjected to a 3-day independent peer review?
Not a 3-day peer review. That was unusual. In NTP peer reviews, they may do 6 chemicals over a 2-day period, as opposed to 1 agent over a 3-day period.
So why did that happen? Why do you think that happened?
But I should say, though, that the peer review panel was also informed about the exposure setup, since this was not a chemical study as typically done by NTP, and they were overly impressed by the nature of the setup for characterizing the exposures to the radiofrequency radiation in rats and mice. So it was highly complimented.
So what groups were involved in setting up the exposure? Could you tell us a little bit about the Austrian and the people who designed the exposure chambers?
Well, when this first came in and I was asked to, if I wanted to participate and work on this, the first place I went to was the National Institute of Standards and Technology, located in Boulder, Colorado. And they have a radio frequency group of physicists. And at that point, we sort of discussed approaches that might be taken. The name of the individual who led that group is Perry Wilson, a very knowledgeable person. And at the time, this might be of interest too, we were aware that there were studies about to begin by the WHO and cell phone industry, wireless industry. A number of us went to Geneva to meet with the WHO and hear presentations of the studies that were planned in conjunction between the WHO and the wireless industry. And one of the presentations that was made there was by a person named Niels Kuster, and he was involved in the design of their approach, which was a Ferris wheel approach, which you may not want to hear in full detail, but it was one in which animals were held in tubes such that they could only be exposed for 2 hours a day without access to water. We felt that this would not provide an adequate challenge to the study, because at the time there was the assumption that radiofrequency radiation could not cause adverse effects other than heating because it did not have enough power or strength to break chemical bonds or cause DNA damage.
Mm-hmm.
The findings of the NTP study, I think, have totally disproven that assumption. So now that FDA has the data and has decided they disagree with the peer review without giving an explanation, it seems to me they're not living up to the basis of their request. They asked for the data so that they could conduct a quantitative risk assessment, and they have punted on this. And simply telling FCC they disagree, there's no evidence, is not based on science. It's based on, again, assumptions and opinions that differ 180 degrees from the peer review panel.
Now, are you aware of what the French government has done recently in terms of evaluating and testing phones, or the results from the Chicago Tribune of testing phones close to the body? Are you familiar with any of that work?
I'm familiar only to the extent that I know that the exposures are higher than have been stated on the cell phones websites for their maximum exposures.
The reason I ask is the following. You see, the criticism the FDA said was the exposures in the NTP study were too high and they involved the whole body. Now, the Chicago Tribune took phones and tested them effectively as though they would be in the pocket, although they actually didn't even put it directly on the body. And they showed that phones could exceed the US test guidelines by up to 5-fold when tested in that manner. And yet the NTP study is rejected by the FDA because the exposures were too high. In fact, what we learned from the Chicago Tribune is that high exposures are the norm, since most people keep phones in their pockets.
Well, there's more to it than even that. I agree with what you're just saying. But in terms of high exposures, we were very careful in developing our exposure conditions and exposure levels. We took the same criteria that FCC used in terms of not exceeding a 1 degree centigrade rise in body temperature. The NTP study was able to demonstrate that you could expose rats to up to 6 watts per kilogram and be within that range. But I'm sure you know from chemical studies, you cannot do a study at current human exposure levels and be able to evaluate risk when the group size is 50 to 100, because we're not interested in only finding agents which will cause a 5 to 10% increase. We want to know what is the risk in 1 in 1,000, 1 in 10,000, 1 in 100,000. You cannot get that from studies of 100 animals. Therefore, in all chemical studies, you need to go higher than current human exposure levels. You develop the dose response information, and from that, the regulatory agencies, EPA and FDA, which should extrapolate this to what are the doses which would be exposure intensity and duration of exposure associated with a certain level of risk, which would be tumor incidence. That's what FDA was asking for. That's what I expected FDA would do, but obviously they decided to just simply ignore the data without any adequate explanation.
So you're saying that when the FDA first nominated the National Toxicology Program to do this study, it was expected that when the findings came out, if there was positive findings of cancer or other effects, that there would be this evaluation, this quantitative risk assessment, which would look at the data and have some numbers about what it might mean for humans based on the NTP data and perhaps other information about human exposures as well. So you could know, is it 1 in 10,000 people that could have a higher risk? Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. That is basically standard operating procedures for federal regulatory agencies.
Right.
It's
So it's
that you use
unusual.
the data.
So they're
Right.
not following the
So-
standard procedure you would have expected.
Right.
Okay, exactly. And in terms of these exposures being high, there's 2 exposures that are discussed with respect to the exposure guidelines. There's a whole body exposure, which for the general public is 0.08 watts per kilogram, and the local exposure, which is 1.6 watts per kilogram for a gram of tissue. So, for example, if you hold a cell phone, and if this is the antenna of a cell phone, if I hold it next to my head, the radiation is emitted there, and the exposure is essentially focused in this region. If I divide that dose by my weight, I'm not giving an accurate level to what is happening in the region where the radiation is emitting. So if the 1.6 watts per kilogram was what we thought would be the most important piece of information for FDA to work with, and the exposures that were used, 1.5, 3, and 6 watts per kilogram, overlap and are only slightly higher than the current guidelines that FCC has promulgated. So this concept of higher exposures all gets fitted in to the quantitative risk assessment, because it's exposure and duration which make the dose. And people aren't exposed equally to cell phone radiation. Some people may use it a half hour a day. Some people may use it half hour a week. Some people may use it 3 hours a day. People hold their phones differently. Some people may only use speakers. Some people may hold it next to their head. What you're looking at is what is the relationship between that exposure in the brain or other organs of the body in relationship to a adverse outcome such as cancer. Right. And that gets worked into the quantitative risk assessment. And the FDA knows this because they do this all the time or they should be doing this all the time for chemical agents.
And let me ask you a question, Ron. In your history with the NTP, when the result would occur with a chemical, what if there's no human data? They would still do a risk assessment based solely on the animal data?
Oh, definitely.
All right.
Because
in this case, they're rejecting the animal data as not relevant.
They're rejecting the animal data, and they're not doing a quantitative risk assessment on the human data. There's human data available on gliomas and acoustic neuromas, which hasn't been worked into this equation either.
Right, right. Do you have any other questions?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out something else that they say. I'm just going to read. They talked about how, in fact, even though some parties claim that the radio frequency exposure procedures for phones should require testing with a 0 spacing, which the French ministers are calling for, that phones are pre-market tested at 0 millimeters from the body, meaning at body contact, that this is unnecessary. I'm quoting the FCC item, that it would be unnecessary to do that. And they go further to explain that, and even if phones exceeded limits, such exposure would still be well below levels considered to be dangerous, and therefore phones legally sold in the United States pose no health risks. So yet they're basically, go ahead.
Well, these statements are made in the absence of the quantitative risk assessment. Right. So you're assuming safety because you didn't do the analysis that would characterize that potential risk. And I also noticed, though, that they claim that the testing is performed against the head. That's not true.
Right.
you can't do a performance of exposure on a human head. It's model based against a simulation fluid. So that kind of statement is just, I would have expected FCC to know that that is not true.
You said phones are in fact not tested against the head. They're tested with a simulation of models that have been developed over the years. Now, with that simulation, they allow the ear to receive as much exposure as the foot or the hand. The ear is called the pinna. And in this order, they say, we are not going to change our determination that the ear can receive as much radiation as the foot or the hand. Now, if the ear receives as much radiation as the foot or the hand, and the ear, of course, is right next to the head, then that means that you're getting even more radiation than you would otherwise get, because they're allowing that much more into the ear because they say it's not biologically important. Well, whether the ear itself is important is irrelevant, because the ear is important because it is right next to the brain. And I would appreciate it if you could comment on that.
But one other point, though, that I think should also be mentioned is that there was a quote I saw that FDA maintains the scientific evidence does not show a danger to any users of cell phones from RF exposure, including children and teenagers. I think this should be turned around to ask, because there's no data on cancer risk from children. There is the Moby Kids study, which is going on, but they haven't produced any cancer results. So I think it would be incumbent upon the FDA or FCC to provide the data that shows it's safe to children and teenagers. If it's the issue where lack of evidence is evidence, which is totally absurd.
Yeah.
It's where is the evidence that shows there is no effect or that it's safe.
In other words, lack of evidence of harm is not proof of safety.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a very important point that we have to make over and over again. And in fact, there is evidence of harm because studies have been done on teenagers, and they have shown that those teens who are the heaviest users of cell phones have statistically significantly poorer memory, and particularly spatial memory. That was actually recently done. So what are we doing here? We're experimenting on our children.
Right.
Let me also add that in terms of the phone testing, it says that first, the FCC says first, phones are tested against the head without any separation distance to represent normal use conditions during a phone call, which, as we talked about, is actually false or at least misleading, because phones are not tested. For example, if you go online, you can see a woman changing a person's diaper where she has this strap to her head. We have people who put in their basketball cap the phone to store it. People who commonly will hold the phone like this, where it's really here and then right at the thyroid, which has not been evaluated. We're not looking at what is the exposure here.
Should also be aware that the phone companies did move the antenna. It used to be up higher. Now it's more at the bottom of the phone. But like
Which
what you said,
problem.
the thyroid is a more highly exposed organ.
Yeah.
And thyroid cancer is really skyrocketing in young people. The CDC just put out their statistics on that. And I think about like people who sleep with the phones. I was with someone who, as she was resting, just laid it on her chest. Apparently this is common. I mean, I don't do this because but some people have their phone on 24/7 and they are with it, snuggling with it underneath their arm. In their bra, constantly.
There's still a lot of kids, millennials, who sleep with their phone right under their pillow so they can not miss anything happening in the middle of the night.
The issue that to me is most important is what are we doing to the future generations, the kids who will be exposed for most of their lifetime to this type of radiation. We need to understand the risks to not have them exposed to levels which could be harmful and potential increased cancer risk. It's not the 70-year-old people. So if a 70-year-old male says to you he's not concerned, great, but that isn't why the study was conducted. It was conducted to find out what is the risk to the general population, and in particular children, as they continuously are exposed to this type of radiation.
So the NTP study was conducted to lend critical information as to what the effects could be to humans.
Exactly. That's why FDA nominated it to NTP. They wanted the information so that they could evaluate what are the human health risks. And that's why it was done.
And now they are rejecting. The FDA is saying it's our opinion that this doesn't apply, and the FCC is using that to rationalize that they don't have to even update their limits, which are they're really over 30 years old, because the science that they used was from 10 years prior to when those limits were even set.
Right.
How do you compare this issue to climate change?
Well, to me, it's a similar situation, what's going on with respect to climate change, in that there's the evidence with respect to the effect of climate change on the Earth. And our country seems to feel we can ignore that information because it may interfere with the profits of the oil industry. With respect to cell phones, we have the evidence, and the FCC feels, or the FDA as well, because both agencies have the regulatory oversight for cell phone radiation, to ignore it. It seems to me also being done to not interfere with the profits of the wireless industry.
Mm-hmm. And there's also just a handful, really a handful of industry-connected scientists and federal governments around the world that are looking to that handful, and they're industry loyal, whereas there are hundreds of scientists who are stating that there is an issue that has to be addressed frankly and honestly related to biological effects from this radiation.
Right. Yeah. We shouldn't be testing on human populations, especially for diseases which can have a long latency and not have an answer for 20 to 30 years, as well as an answer which it could have an adverse effect on individuals.
There's so many studies that are just keep accumulating, showing effects on wildlife and birds and bees. And yet there's not a single, like the FDA doesn't have any expertise, nor the authority, nor budget to be looking at effects to bees and trees. And there's no agency, health and safety agency that I know of, that has jurisdiction to address that, especially when it comes to 5G with all of these antennas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's a lot of expertise that's missing at the FDA right now.
But the FDA,
maybe it's easier to ignore data if you don't know how to use it.
I mean, with all these antennas, 800,000 new antennas that are going to be just in the United States alone, there's no agency who's looking at whether we have a safe allowable limit in terms of the maximum permissible exposure limits.
Right, yeah. Yeah, no, that's true. As Senator Blumenthal said, we seem to be flying high, not knowing what we're doing.
We are flying blind.
Flying blindly, right?
So again, we really want to thank you for your leadership on this issue and look forward to continuing to work with you. It is an honor and a privilege, and I'm glad that you're able to
working with you guys.
Well, we really do appreciate it a great deal, Ron. Thank you so much, Dr. Melnick.
Bye-bye.